Welcome to your personalized deep dive. We're going to be exploring Philippine criminal law, and we'll be uncovering some surprising principles and penalties.
Yeah, definitely. And we're not just going to be, listing out laws. We're going to try to understand the logic behind them, how different situations can lead to very different outcomes.
Okay, great. Well, let's get started then. So at the very beginning, this document lays out some of the foundations of criminal liability. So like the theories that explain how the Philippines approaches crime and punishment.
Yeah, so there are three main theories that are discussed here: classical, positivist, and eclectic. Kind of think of them as different lenses for viewing criminal behavior.
Okay, so lenses, so like different ways of looking at the same thing.
Right, exactly. So like with the classical theory, it really emphasizes free will, like the idea that people are weighing the benefits of a crime against the potential punishment. So to deter crime, the law sets very clear consequences.
Okay, so it's all about consequences. Got it. And then there's the positivist theory, which seems to take a little bit broader view, right?
Yeah, it does. Positivist theory kind of steps back and looks at all the different external factors that might contribute to a crime. So things like, poverty, lack of education, maybe even biological factors in some cases.
So the focus shifts then from punishing to understanding like what led to the crime in the first place.
Right. The goal becomes not just punishment, but also rehabilitation. Addressing those root causes so that you can ideally prevent future crimes. And actually, a great example of this is the indeterminate sentence law.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work?
So instead of like a fixed sentence, the judge will set a minimum and a maximum term. And then from there is a possibility of early release based on the offender's, progress and behavior in prison.
So it's less about just, locking someone up and throwing away the key and more about giving them a chance, like to turn their life around.
Exactly. It's about that balance. Then you have the eclectic theory, which tries to kind of, bring together both sides of the argument.
Yeah, so it combines classical and positivist.
Right. It's acknowledging that it's not always one or the other. Both individual choices, A and D, external factors, contribute to criminal behavior. So the eclectic theory really advocates for like a balanced approach to the justice system.
Okay, that makes sense. So you're considering like both punishment A and D, the potential for rehabilitation.
Yeah, you got it. All right, so we've talked about the theories behind criminal liability. Now let's actually look at some of the laws themselves.
Okay, sounds good. So something that kind of surprised me was this concept of retroactive application. Are you telling me that criminal laws in the Philippines can actually apply to things that people did before the law was even passed?
Yeah, so it might seem counterintuitive, but there are some specific situations where that's allowed. Like one example is if a new law is more favorable to someone who's been accused of a crime.
Okay, so like if it reduces the punishment for something.
Exactly. In that case, it can be applied retroactively. The source material also says that if a law completely decriminalizes something, like it's not even crime anymore, then any past convictions related to that act would be wiped clean.
Okay, so it's like it never even happened.
Right, and there's one more exception. Sometimes a new law will specifically state that it should apply retroactively.
Oh, interesting. So they build that right into the law.
Yeah, but even then, it can't violate the constitutional prohibition against ex post facto laws.
Okay, wait, back up. What is an ex post facto law?
It basically means that you can't punish someone for something that wasn't a crime when they did it. That's a pretty fundamental principle of justice,
Right, that makes sense. No one wants to be surprised by some, new law that suddenly makes them a criminal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Let's talk about the crimes themselves.
Okay, sounds good to me. Now, the source here distinguishes between two types of crimes, mala in se and mala prohibita.
Right, yeah. So mala in se refers to things that are like universally considered wrong, regardless of whether or not there's actually a law against it.
Okay, so like murder, theft, assault.
Exactly. Those are good examples. Mala prohibita, on the other hand, that's more about things that are wrong because the law says they're wrong.
So that's more like, traffic violations or operating a business without a permit, that kind of thing.
Yep, you got it. And this distinction actually plays a really important role in how the Philippine legal system operates.
Okay, so how does it all actually work in practice?
That's where we get into the cardinal principles of criminal law. These are kind of like the foundational rules that determine how the law is actually applied.
Okay, well, let's hear them. What are these cardinal principles?
So there are three of them: generality, territoriality, and prospectivity. Generality basically means that these same criminal laws apply to everyone in the Philippines, no matter where they're from.
Okay, so no one gets special treatment.
Right? Everyone is subject to the same rules. Territoriality. That's the idea that a crime has to be committed within the Philippines to be punishable under Philippine law. But of course, there are exceptions.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, like international agreements, treaties and things like that. A good example is the Visiting Forces Agreement.
Oh, the VFA. That's the one between the Philippines and the U.S., right?
Right, exactly. So the VFA, it kind of sets its own rules for jurisdiction over crimes committed by U.S. military personnel.
So there are situations where the Philippines might not have jurisdiction over a crime, even if it happened on Philippine soil.
Yeah, it can get pretty complicated. And then the third principle, prospectivity, that's the one we were talking about earlier, about laws only being applied to future actions.
Right, so no retroactive surprises, generally speaking.
Right, though, as we've already seen, there are some exceptions to that rule as well.
Okay, so these principles are kind of like guidelines, then, but not set in stone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They help create some consistency in the legal system, but they're not absolute.
Gotcha. So we've got these principles to set the stage, but what about individual rights? What are the protections that are built into the system to make sure that everything is fair?
So the source material highlights two big ones: equal protection and due process. They're actually enshrined in the Philippine Constitution.
Okay, those are pretty fundamental legal concepts. How do they actually apply to criminal law?
So equal protection, that means that individuals who are in similar situations should be treated the same way under the law. The source material points out, though, sometimes a law can seem neutral, but be discriminatory in how it's actually used.
Yeah, so like a law against loitering could actually be used unfairly to target a specific group of people.
Right, that's a great example. Now, due process, that's all about making sure that people are treated fairly throughout the legal process. So, they have the right to be notified of the charges against them, to have a lawyer, to present evidence in their defense, and all that.
Okay, so it's about protecting people from being unjustly accused and, making sure they have a fair chance to defend themselves.
Exactly. Now, let's dive into some of the trickier parts of criminal liability, like proximate cause and efficient intervening cause.
Ooh, those sound like they could get pretty complicated.
They can. So, proximate cause, that's the act or omission that sets off a chain of events, directly leading to some kind of injury or harm.
Okay, so like the first domino in a chain reaction.
Right. Now, an efficient intervening cause, that's something that comes along and kind of breaks that chain of causation. The source gives an example. Imagine someone carelessly leaves a ladder leaning against a wall. Later, an earthquake hits, and the ladder falls on someone, injuring them.
Oh, wow. Okay, so even though someone was negligent in leaving the ladder there, the earthquake is what actually caused the injury.
Exactly. It was an unforeseen event that broke the chain of causation.
The law is full of these tricky little scenarios, isn't it? Now, what about intent? How much does someone's intent actually matter when it comes to determining their criminal liability?
Intent is huge EE.
Mm.
The source material gets into some really interesting situations like aberratio ictus, error in personae, and praeter intentionem.
Wow, those are some fancy legal terms. Break it down for me.
Okay, so aberratio ictus, that's basically mistaken blow. So you aim at one person, but accidentally hit someone else.
Oh, okay, so even if you hit the wrong person, you're still responsible, right?
Right. But the court will definitely consider the fact that you didn't mean to hit that particular person. Now, error in personae, that's when you intend to harm someone, but you have the wrong person.
So, like, you think you're shooting at your enemy, but it turns out to be someone else who just looks like them?
Yeah, that's a tragic example.
Yeah.
And lastly, praeter intentionem means the harm you caused is greater than what you intended. Like, say you punch someone, but they fall, hit their head, and die. You didn't mean to kill them, but you're still responsible for their death.
So the law recognizes that sometimes, actions can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it holds people accountable for the full extent of the harm they cause, even if they didn't necessarily intend for it to go that far.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the source also talks about these different levels of crime, like felonies based on gravity. What does that actually mean?
It's basically a way to categorize crimes based on how serious they are, how much harm they cause to individuals or to society as a whole. And in the Philippines, there are 3 levels: grave felonies, less grave felonies, and light felonies.
Okay, so grave felonies, I'm guessing those are the really serious ones, like murder.
Right. Things like murder, treason, some types of drug trafficking, those carry the heaviest penalties, like life in prison or even the death penalty in some cases.
Okay, that makes sense. Then less grave felonies, those are kind of in the middle, right?
Yeah, they'll usually get you a shorter prison sentence than a grave felony.
And then light felonies, are those just like, minor offenses?
Well, even light felonies can come with some pretty hefty fines. The source material says they can range from something like 6,000 pesos to over 1,000,000 pesos.
Wow, okay, so even a light felony could really set you back financially.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The law takes all of these levels of offenses seriously.
Okay, so we've got these different categories of crimes. Now, I'm curious about the things that can actually affect how someone is punished. The source here talks about justifying and exempting circumstances. What's the difference between those two?
Okay, so justifying circumstances, those completely remove criminal liability because what the person did is actually considered lawful. Self-defense is a good example.
Oh, yeah, so you're allowed to protect yourself from harm.
Exactly. Exempting circumstances, on the other hand, acknowledge that a crime has been committed, but the person isn't held responsible because of the specific situation.
So, like, if someone commits a crime, but they're legally insane, they might not be held criminally liable.
Right, they don't have the mental capacity to understand what they're doing.
Okay, so it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card, but only in very specific situations.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. Now let's dig a little deeper into self-defense.
All right, I'm all ears. What exactly does it take to claim self-defense?
So the key requirement is something called unlawful aggression. It basically means that there has to be a real imminent threat of harm.
Okay, so you can't just, like, feel threatened. You have to actually be in danger.
Right. And the source material actually gives some good examples here. Like, if you see someone reaching into their pocket, that's not necessarily unlawful aggression. But if they pull out a gun and point it at you, well, that's a different story.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. So the threat has to be real and immediate for self-defense to be a valid justification.
Exactly. And that's why things like battered woman syndrome can be so tricky, because you have to consider the psychological impact of prolonged abuse,
Yeah, that makes sense. Their perception of threat might be very different from someone who hasn't gone through that kind of trauma.
Right. Okay, now, besides justifying and exempting circumstances, there's also mitigating and aggravating circumstances.
Okay, and those can either lessen or increase someone's punishment, right?
Exactly. So mitigating circumstances, those kind of work in the offender's favor. Things like voluntarily surrendering to the police, or maybe they cooperated with the investigation, or they were acting under extreme duress.
So it's like they're acknowledging what they did and maybe trying to make amends so their punishment is reduced.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Aggravating circumstances, those are things that make the crime more serious. Things like cruelty, premeditation, committing a crime at a place of worship.
Oh, wow. So if you really plan out your crime or you intentionally inflict a lot of suffering, that's going to make things worse for you.
Right. And the source material points out that some aggravating circumstances are just built into certain crimes.
Okay, so like what? Give me an example.
So treachery, which basically means like taking advantage of someone's vulnerability, that's always considered an aggravating circumstance in a murder case.
So it's not just about the act itself, it's also about the way in which the crime was committed.
Exactly. It can get really nuanced. Like, you know how breaking into someone's home is an aggravating circumstance?
Yeah, makes sense. It's their private space.
But it's only an aggravating circumstance for robbery with violence, not for robbery with force upon things.
Oh, that's interesting. So the location matters more when the crime involves violence against a person.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how they think about these things. Now, besides mitigating and aggravating circumstances, there's also these alternative circumstances.
Okay, and those can either help or hurt you, depending on the situation, right?
Right, like intoxication.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work?
Well, if you intentionally got drunk or high before committing a crime, that could actually make your punishment worse.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Because it shows that you didn't really care about the potential consequences of your actions. But if you were, say, unknowingly drugged, that could work in your favor.
Okay, that makes sense. You were in control of your actions.
Exactly. So you can see how complex these alternative circumstances can get.
Yeah, the law really is all about nuance.
It is. Now let's move on to talking about the different roles that people can play in a crime. You've got your principals, accomplices, and accessories.
Okay, so how do those categories work?
So principals, those are the main players. They're either the ones who came up with the plan, or the ones who actually carried out the crime. Accomplices, they help out with the crime, but they're not like the main drivers.
Okay, so like the getaway driver in a bank robbery.
That's the classic example. Accessories, on the other hand, those are the people who come in after the crime has already been committed.
Okay, so what do they do?
Things like helping to hide evidence or helping the criminals escape, maybe even helping them profit from the crime.
So they're like the cleanup crew helping to cover up the crime.
Exactly. Now, each of these roles comes with a different level of punishment.
Okay, so the principals, they get the harshest punishment, right?
Right, because they're considered the most responsible. Then accomplices get a lighter sentence, and accessories get the lightest punishment of the three.
Makes sense. The more involved you are in the crime, the more accountable you are.
Now let's talk about punishments in general. The source here talks about principal and accessory penalties.
Okay, so principal penalties, those are like the main punishments for the crime, right?
Exactly. And they can be all sorts of things. Prison time, fines, restrictions on certain rights, the whole gamut.
Okay, so what are accessory penalties?
Those are kind of like add-ons that automatically come with certain principal penalties.
Sure.
So say someone gets sentenced to a really long prison term, they might also lose their right to vote or their right to hold public office.
Wow. So even after they've served their time, they might still face limitations on their freedoms.
Yeah, sometimes. And there's this really interesting penalty called destierro.
Testiero, what's that?
It basically means banishment from a specific location.
Oh, wow. So you're not allowed to go to certain places?
Right. It's a way to keep the offender away from a certain person or a certain area, to prevent future problems.
So there's a geographical element to the punishment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, remember how we talked about the indeterminate sentence law earlier?
Yeah, that's the one where the judge sets a minimum and a maximum sentence, right?
Right. So the offender has a chance to earn early release.
So it's about balancing punishment with rehabilitation,
Yeah.
giving people a chance to turn things around.
Exactly. Now, speaking of alternatives to imprisonment, let's talk about probation.
Okay, probation. So you get to avoid jail time, but you have to follow certain rules, right?
Right. It allows people to serve their sentences in the community, but they're under supervision.
Yeah.
They might have to maintain a job, attend counseling, do community service, things like that.
So it's about providing support and structure to help them reintegrate into society.
Exactly. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the different ways that criminal liability can end.
Right, like serving your sentence or getting a pardon.
And we've talked about some of the specific penalties that are used in the Philippine legal system. But now I think the big question is, what happens next? Like, do the consequences of a crime just disappear once someone's liability is extinguished?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess that's something we'll have to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Exactly. Stay tuned.
We've been talking about different types of penalties and even alternatives to going to prison, but I'm curious about what happens next. How does criminal liability actually end?
That's a great question. You might think that, once you've served your time or paid your dues, that everything just goes back to normal. But it's not always so simple. The source material actually lays out a bunch of different ways that criminal liability can be extinguished.
Okay, so let's hear them. What's the first way?
Okay, so one way is through what's called the prescription of crimes. It's basically a statute of limitations on prosecution.
Oh, so after a certain amount of time has passed, the government just can't prosecute someone anymore, even if they know they're guilty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting. Those time limits could be totally different depending on the severity of the crime. Like for really minor offenses, it could be as short as 1 year. But for serious crimes like murder, it could be up to 20 years.
Wow, okay, so that's a huge difference. Why such a big range?
I think it kind of shows how seriously society views the crime. For minor crimes, maybe it's more important to just resolve things quickly. But for major crimes, the government has a stronger interest in making sure that perpetrators are held accountable, even if it takes a while.
Right, like some crimes just have a longer lasting impact on society. Makes sense. What are some other ways that criminal liability can end?
Okay, so another way is through a pardon. It's an act of, executive clemency, usually granted by the president,
Yeah.
and it completely absolves someone of their criminal liability.
Oh, so like a get out of jail free card, but from the highest authority.
Yeah, you could kind of think of it like that. It's usually granted for humanitarian reasons, like, releasing elderly prisoners or those who are terminally ill.
Okay, that makes sense. What about amnesty? How is that different from a pardon?
So amnesty is kind of similar, but it usually applies to a whole group of people, often for political offenses. So it's like this blanket forgiveness for past actions. You see it a lot in peace processes or national reconciliation efforts.
Oh, right. So if there's been like a period of unrest or rebellion, this is a way for everyone to move on.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to kind of acknowledge past wrongs, but also try to move forward and rebuild.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got prescription of crimes, we've got pardons and amnesty. Are there any other ways that criminal liability can be extinguished?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's also the death of the offender.
Well, I guess that's pretty straightforward. There's no one left to prosecute.
Yeah, that's one way. And of course, there's serving out your sentence. Once you've completed your punishment, then your criminal liability for that specific crime is extinguished.
Okay, so it's like you've paid your debt to society and now you can move on.
You could see it that way. But I think it's important to remember that there can still be some lingering consequences, like certain rights might still be limited even after someone has served their sentence.
Yeah, that's a good point. We talked about those accessory penalties earlier and how those can have some pretty lasting effects.
Right, and the source material even mentions a few kind of unusual situations. Like for certain crimes against chastity, if the offender marries the offended party, then their criminal liability is extinguished.
Oh, wow. Okay, so in those cases, marriage is basically seen as a way to reconcile and potentially prevent, further problems.
Yeah, you can look at it like that. And it definitely makes you think about how the law reflects societal norms.
Yeah.
Things that might have been considered really scandalous in the past might not be seen that way today.
That's a really interesting point. Like the law has to adapt to changing social values and expectations.
Right, exactly. It's a living thing constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've covered how criminal liability ends, let's actually get into some of the specific crimes that are outlined in the Philippine Criminal Code. This is where it starts to get really interesting.
Yeah, let's dive into some of these crimes. I'm really curious about this category of crimes against chastity. What exactly are we talking about here?
So these are offenses that are basically meant to protect marriage and relationships. The source material specifically talks about adultery and concubinage.
Okay. I've heard those terms, but can you explain the difference?
Sure. So adultery happens when a married woman has sexual intercourse with someone other than her husband. And both the woman and her partner can be held liable.
So it's about maintaining fidelity within the marriage.
Right. And concubinage is similar, but it applies when a married man has a mistress. And there's this added element of, making it public or kind of flaunting it.
Oh, so it's not just about the infidelity itself. It's about the impact on the marriage and the family's reputation.
Yeah, exactly. It's about causing a scandal.
It really makes you think about how these laws would be applied today. Attitudes towards relationships are so different now.
Right. And the law is always trying to catch up with changing social norms. Sometimes it's a little bit behind.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about some of the more serious crimes, like crimes against national security.
Okay, so now we're getting into the heavy stuff. These are offenses that threaten the very safety and stability of the Philippines, like treason, for instance.
Yeah, treason, that's like the ultimate betrayal, right?
It is, and the source material is very specific about this. Treason is a war crime. You can't actually commit treason during times of peace. It's all about betraying your country to its enemies during a time of war.
Wow, so it's not just about disagreeing with the government or protesting. It's about actively helping the enemy.
Right, exactly. Now, there's also rebellion and insurrection, which involve a group of people taking up arms against the government.
Okay, so it's like a full-on uprising trying to overthrow the existing power.
Yeah. And then there's sedition, which is a little bit less serious. It's about inciting people to rebel, but without actually resorting to violence.
So it's more about words and ideas than actual armed conflict.
Right. It's about that line between expressing dissent and actively trying to overthrow the government.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those crimes that are described as violations against the fundamental law of the state? What does that even mean?
So those are offenses that basically undermine the entire legal system or violate people's basic rights, things like arbitrary detention or illegal searches and seizures.
So we're talking about abuses of power, usually by people in positions of authority.
Exactly. Arbitrary detention is when someone is deprived of their liberty without any legal justification. They're just thrown in jail without due process.
Wow, that sounds scary. And what about those illegal searches and seizures?
That's all about protecting people's privacy. The police can't just barge into your home without a warrant or a really good reason. It's about respecting the sanctity of your home.
Right. Everyone deserves to feel safe and secure in their own home. It's a fundamental right.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's move on to crimes against public order.
Right.
They're not as dramatic as treason or rebellion, but they can still disrupt the peace and make people feel unsafe.
Right, like what kinds of things are we talking about here?
So the source mentions things like tumults and other disturbances, alarms and scandals, illegal assemblies and associations.
Tumults. That sounds pretty chaotic.
It is. Think about like starting a riot or inciting a mob.
Yeah.
That kind of behavior is definitely a crime against public order.
What about alarms and scandals? What falls under that category?
It's basically about intentionally causing fear or annoyance or just generally disturbing the peace, like setting off fireworks in the middle of the night or blasting loud music that bothers your neighbors.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely see how that would be considered a crime.
Right. And then there's illegal assemblies and associations, which is about forming or joining groups that are involved in unlawful activities.
So even though people have the right to assemble, there are limits, especially if the group is engaged in something harmful or dangerous.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about crimes against public interest. These are offenses that might not be as obvious or as violent, but they can still have a huge impact on society.
Right, because they undermine trust and create a sense of unfairness.
Exactly. The source material mentions things like counterfeiting, forgery, perjury, and fraud.
Okay, so counterfeiting, I'm thinking fake money, fake designer bags. What else?
Well, counterfeiting can also involve fake documents like passports or diplomas, anything that's created with the intent to deceive.
So it's all about creating something fake in order to trick people.
Right. And then forgery, that's more about altering or falsifying existing documents, usually for a financial gain.
So like forging someone's signature on a check or changing a will to get more money?
Exactly. It's all about manipulating documents for illegal purposes. Now, perjury, that's a really interesting one. It's basically about lying under oath.
Oh, so if you're a witness in court and you lie on the stand, that's perjury. Right. And it's a big deal because it undermines the whole legal process. Everyone is supposed to be telling the truth in court.
Makes sense. What about fraud?
Fraud is a really broad category. It basically covers any kind of deceptive action that's designed to gain something of value.
So like running scams or conning people out of their money?
Exactly. Think about those Ponzi schemes you hear about, where people invest their life savings and then it all disappears.
Yeah, that's awful. It's amazing how creative people can be when it comes to finding ways to cheat the system.
It's true. And the law is always trying to catch up, create new laws to address these new types of fraud.
It's like a never-ending battle.
Okay, so we've talked about crimes against national security, crimes against public order, crimes against public interest. Now let's get into crimes against persons.
Okay, so those are the crimes where someone is directly harmed physically or emotionally.
Exactly. And we're talking about some pretty serious offenses here. Things like murder, homicide, physical injuries.
So murder, that's pretty straightforward, right? It's the intentional killing of another person. Right. But then you have homicide, which might not always involve the same level of intent or premeditation. Like there's parricide, which is the killing of a close relative.
Okay, so like killing your parent or your spouse or your child.
Exactly. And the source material also mentioned this category of death or physical injuries under exceptional circumstances.
Okay, what are those exceptional circumstances?
It's kind of a tricky one, but basically it means that there might be a partial defense to the crime. Like let's say someone catches their spouse in the act of adultery and they kill the spouse or the lover in a fit of rage.
Oh, wow. So the law kind of recognizes that those intense emotions could lead to extreme actions.
Right. It's not an excuse, but it might be considered a mitigating factor when it comes to sentencing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So basically, crimes against persons cover a whole spectrum of offenses, from those that are carefully planned out to those that are more impulsive or driven by strong emotions.
Exactly. The law has to take all those nuances into account when determining guilt and punishment.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about crimes against personal liberty and security. These are the crimes that take away someone's freedom or make them feel unsafe.
Right. So we're talking about things like kidnapping, unlawful arrest, even slavery.
Kidnapping. That's a pretty terrifying crime, someone being taken against their will, often for ransom.
Yeah, it's a serious violation of someone's freedom and safety. And then there's unlawful arrest, which is when someone is detained without any legal justification.
So it's like an abuse of power by someone who has the authority to arrest people.
Right. And then you have slavery, which is unfortunately still a reality in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
It's about forced labor and exploitation.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that something like slavery still exists, but it's a reminder that we have to constantly be vigilant about protecting human rights.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's move on to a category of crimes that might seem less serious, but can still have a huge impact on people's lives. Crimes against property.
Yeah, I bet these are probably some of the most common crimes.
Probably. We see these crimes in the news all the time. The source material talks about robbery, theft, estafa.
Okay, robbery. So isn't robbery just like Stealing something?
But it's a little more specific than that. Robbery always involves the use of force or intimidation or violence. So it's not just about taking something, it's about taking it in a threatening way.
Okay, so
Oh,
like holding someone up at gunpoint versus just swiping something when no one's looking?
exactly. And the source material even distinguishes between robbery with violence against or intimidation of persons and robbery with force upon things.
So like breaking into a house and stealing things versus mugging someone on the street.
You got it.
Uh,
And then you have theft, which is just taking someone's property without their consent, but without using any force or intimidation.
So like picking pockets or shoplifting.
Exactly. And then there's estafa, which is sometimes called swindling. It's all about deception.
Hmm.
Tricking someone into giving you something of value.
Oh, so like those elaborate scams you hear about where people get conned out of their life savings?
Exactly. It's all about abusing trust and taking advantage of people.
Wow, so crimes against property can take so many different forms. It's amazing how creative people can be when it comes to figuring out ways to take things that don't belong to them.
I know, right? Okay, so we've covered the crimes that are outlined in the Philippine Criminal Code,
Yeah.
but we also need to talk about offenses that are covered under what are called special penal laws.
Oh, right. So those are laws that deal with specific issues or types of crime.
Exactly. Like the source material mentions dangerous drugs, firearms, and cybercrime.
Okay, those are definitely hot button issues these days. So what are some of the offenses that are covered under the special penal laws related to dangerous drugs?
So the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002, which is also known as Republic Act 9165, it basically covers anything and everything to do with illegal drugs. Manufacturing, sale, possession, use, it's all in there.
So it's a really comprehensive approach to tackling the drug problem.
It is, and the penalties can be very serious, especially for people who are involved in large-scale drug trafficking or production.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about firearms? I know the Philippines has some pretty strict gun laws.
Yeah, they do Republic Act. No,
Okay.
10591, also known as the Comprehensive Firearms and Ammunition Regulation Act. That's the one that sets all the rules for owning and using guns.
So you can't just go buy a gun like you can in some other countries.
Nope. There are tons of requirements, background checks, psychological evaluations, training courses, the whole 9 yards.
It sounds like they're really trying to make sure that only responsible people have access to firearms.
Yeah, the focus is definitely on public safety.
Now, what about cybercrime? That's a pretty new area of law, right?
It is. But it's becoming increasingly important as we spend more and more of our lives online. The Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012 or Republic Act. No, 10175, that's the one that deals with all the crimes that happen online.
So like hacking, identity theft, online scams, things like that.
Exactly. And cyberbullying, distribution of child pornography. It
Yeah.
covers a lot of ground.
So it's like taking all the traditional crimes and figuring out how they apply to the internet.
That's a good way to put it. It's a whole new frontier for law enforcement.
It's amazing how quickly technology changes and how the law has to constantly adapt.
And it's not just cybercrime. The source material also mentions some other specialized areas of law, like laws against cattle rustling.
Cattle rustling, really? That's still a thing.
It is,
Yeah.
especially in agricultural communities.
Yeah.
And then there are anti-graft and corruption laws, which focus on making sure that public officials are behaving ethically.
Yeah, we need those for sure. And what were those last ones?
Anti-hazing laws. So those are all about preventing those dangerous initiation rituals that you sometimes see in fraternities and sororities.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Hazing can be so dangerous and sometimes even deadly. It's good that there are laws to protect people from that.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. We've talked about how criminal liability ends, and we've gone through a whole list of specific offenses. But now I think we need to step back and ask, what's the point of all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it just about punishing people or is there something more to it?
That's a really big question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we're going to try to answer in the final part of our deep dive.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Philippine criminal law, everything from those theories of criminal liability to specific offenses and how criminal liability can actually come to an end.
It's definitely a really complex system full of all sorts of twists and turns.
It really is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about this question, like, what's the point of all of this? Is it just about punishment? Or is there something more going on here?
Yeah, that's a question that people have been debating for a really long time.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Why do societies punish people who break the law? Like, what are they trying to achieve?
Well, one of the main goals is this idea of retribution, like the idea that if you harm someone else, you deserve to be punished.
Okay, so it's about holding people accountable for their actions, making sure that justice is served.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not as simple as it sounds. Like in the old days, it was all about an eye for an eye. But the modern approach to retribution is a lot more nuanced.
Ah, so it's not just about revenge then.
Right. It's more about making sure that the punishment actually fits the crime. That it's proportional to the harm that was caused.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging the wrong that was done, but also making sure that the punishment isn't too harsh or too lenient.
Exactly. Okay, so we got retribution. What are some of the other goals of punishment?
Well, I imagine deterrence is a big one, right? Like the idea that if people know they'll be punished for breaking the law, they're less likely to do it.
Right. Deterrence is huge. It actually works on two levels. There's general deterrence, which is about deterring everyone in society from committing crimes.
Okay, so it's like sending a message that crime doesn't pay.
Exactly. And then there's specific deterrence, which is focused on the individual who committed the crime.
Yeah.
The goal there is to prevent them from doing it again.
Okay, so it's like a two-pronged approach, trying to prevent both first-time offenders and repeat offenders.
Exactly. Now, another goal of punishment is rehabilitation, which is really closely tied to that positivist theory we talked about earlier.
Right, that's the idea that sometimes people commit crimes because of external factors like poverty or lack of education.
Right. And the goal of rehabilitation is to address those underlying causes and help people to change their behavior.
So it's not just about punishing them, it's about giving them the tools and the support they need to turn their lives around.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's based on the belief that people can change, that they can learn from their mistakes and become productive members of society.
Yeah, that's a much more hopeful approach than just locking people up and throwing away the key.
Okay, now there's one more goal of punishment that we need to talk about, and that's incapacitation.
Okay, incapacitation, what does that mean?
It's basically about removing dangerous individuals from society in order to protect everyone else.
Okay, so we're talking about things like imprisonment or other forms of confinement where someone is physically prevented from committing more crimes.
Exactly. And sometimes this goal of incapacitation can conflict with other goals, like rehabilitation, for example.
Yeah, because if someone is locked up, they don't really have the opportunity to work on themselves and make positive changes in their lives.
Right, so it's a balancing act. The criminal justice system has to weigh all of these different goals. And sometimes the focus might shift more towards one goal or another, depending on the circumstances.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
It is, but I think that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and it really forces us to grapple with some fundamental questions about justice and fairness and what it means to be a responsible member of society.
I totally agree. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Philippine criminal law, what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how complex this whole system is. It's not just a bunch of rules and regulations. It's a reflection of our values as a society and the way we view right and wrong. And it's constantly evolving as we learn more about crime and punishment and how to create a more just and equitable society.
That's a great point. And I hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive that there's always more to learn.
Yeah.
Keep asking those questions and keep challenging your own assumptions.
Exactly. Because the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a journey that never really ends.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But for all you legal enthusiasts out there, keep exploring, keep those minds churning, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.
Thanks for listening, everyone.